Think for a moment. Imagine that the world you perceive every day is only the surface of a far deeper and more complex reality. Imagine that behind social structures, behind belief systems, behind the invisible pressures that shape your thoughts and emotions, there exist forces that thrive on one condition alone: your unconsciousness. Now imagine that Jesus did not come merely to establish a moral code or a religious institution, but to reveal hidden knowledge capable of breaking these invisible chains. What if his most radical teachings were intentionally veiled, preserved only for those willing to look beyond the literal and into the symbolic, the mystical, and the eternal? Imagine further that among these teachings, Jesus revealed 3 sacred objects that the Archons fear above all else. Not objects you can hold in your hands, not relics hidden in temples or deserts, but living spiritual realities that must be carried within you. And imagine that the last of these is the most powerful of all, capable of dissolving fear at its root and restoring something humanity has almost entirely forgotten. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation is not only the most important, it may radically transform how you understand yourself, life, and the universe itself. If you are drawn to hidden wisdom, ancient mysteries, and the deeper layers of spiritual truth, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like, share this video, and write a comment. These teachings are not commonly discussed, and what will be revealed here has the potential to shift your entire perception of reality. To understand why these sacred objects matter, we must first understand the nature of the Archons. The concept originates from ancient Gnostic traditions, especially texts rediscovered in the Nag Hammadi library in the 20th century. Renowned scholars such as Elaine Pagels, Jonas, and Gilles Kispel explain that the Archons were described as cosmic rulers or administrators of the material realm. They are not portrayed as demons in the simplistic sense, but as forces of limitation, deception, and fragmentation. Their power does not come from strength, but from ignorance. They rule by keeping humanity distracted, fearful, divided, and disconnected from its inner source. In Gnostic cosmology, the Archons are counterfeit authorities. They imitate divine order, but lack true creative power. This is why their greatest enemy is not rebellion or violence, but awakening. When a human being remembers who they are, the Archons lose influence automatically. Control collapses in the presence of awareness. Within this framework, Jesus emerges not merely as a savior figure, but as a revealer. The Gospel of Thomas opens with a striking statement: "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and whoever finds their interpretation will not taste death." This does not refer to physical immortality, but to liberation from spiritual ignorance. Jesus speaks repeatedly of eyes that do not see and ears that do not hear, pointing to a humanity asleep within its own existence. The first sacred object the Archons fear is awareness, not surface-level attention, but deep conscious presence. When Jesus says that the kingdom of God is within you and around you, he is not describing a future place or external realm. He is pointing to a state of perception. Awareness reveals reality as it is, stripped of illusion, fear, and false identity. Archons thrive when human beings live mechanically, identified with compulsive thoughts, emotional reactions, and inherited beliefs. Awareness disrupts this mechanism. When you observe your thoughts instead of automatically believing them, when you witness fear instead of being consumed by it, you step outside the machinery of control. This aligns with the teachings of early Christian mystics like Origen of Alexandria, who taught that Christ awakens the divine intellect within the human soul. Modern thinkers echo this ancient insight. Philosopher Pierre Hadot emphasized that ancient spiritual traditions were not about abstract doctrines, but about inner practices that transformed perception. Awareness is not passive observation. It is an active force that dissolves illusion. This is why silence, contemplation, and self-inquiry have always been discouraged by systems that rely on control. A conscious individual cannot be easily manipulated. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your day is lived on autopilot? How often are your reactions driven by fear, desire, or social conditioning rather than clarity? What would happen if you became fully present in this very moment? Write in the comments what most distracts you from being aware. The second sacred object the Archons fear is truth, lived with integrity. Jesus repeatedly emphasized truth not as information, but as alignment. In the Gospel of John, he declares that the truth will set you free. This freedom is not political or social at first, but internal. The Archons depend on inner division. When a person thinks one thing, feels another, and lives something else, they become fragmented and easily controlled. Gnostic writings describe the Archons as counterfeit creators who rule through false narratives. Truth dismantles these narratives. To live in truth does not mean to confront others aggressively, but to refuse self-deception. Psychologist Carl Jung later articulated this when he warned that what is not made conscious appears in life as fate. A divided inner world creates external bondage. Integrity unifies the self. When your words, actions, and inner values align, you generate coherence. This coherence destabilizes systems built on fear and contradiction. This is why authoritarian structures often punish honesty and reward conformity. Truth exposes illusion simply by existing. Reflect deeply on this question. Where in your life do you silence your truth to feel accepted, safe, or comfortable? What would change if you lived more authentically, even in small ways? Yet awareness and truth, powerful as they are not the final revelation. Jesus pointed to something even deeper, something that surpasses perception and integrity combined. There is a third sacred object, one that the Archons cannot imitate, corrupt, or withstand. It is the ultimate shield against fear, and the final boundary they cannot cross. This is where the teaching becomes truly transformative. The third sacred object that Jesus revealed cannot be understood through intellect alone. It is not grasped by analysis, belief, or ritual. It must be experienced. This is precisely why the Archons fear it more than awareness and truth combined, because while awareness exposes them and truth weakens them, this final object dissolves their very foundation. Jesus spoke of it constantly, yet always in paradox, symbols, and stories. He called it love, but not in the sentimental sense the world later reduced it to. This was not emotion, attraction, or attachment. It was a state of being, a force of consciousness, an emanation of the divine itself. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says that God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God. To the modern ear, this sounds poetic, but in the mystical context of early Christianity and Gnosticism, this was a radical metaphysical statement. Love was understood as the vibrational state of unity. Where love is present, separation collapses, and the Archons, whose power depends entirely on separation, cannot survive there. Gnostic scholar Jonas explained that the Archons rule through fragmentation. They divide spirit from matter, mind from body, human from divine. Fear is their primary instrument because fear creates boundaries. Love, in its pure form, dissolves boundaries. This is why Jesus insisted that love your enemy is not moral idealism, but spiritual warfare. An enemy only exists where separation exists. When separation dissolves, domination loses meaning. The Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text, states that those who say they will die first and then rise are mistaken. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they live, they will receive nothing when they die. Resurrection here refers to awakening into unity. Love is the vehicle of this resurrection. The Archons cannot comprehend love because love does not operate through hierarchy. It does not dominate, manipulate, or coerce. It radiates, it attracts, it restores. This is why systems built on control often mock compassion, label empathy as weakness, and glorify domination. Love dismantles power structures without resistance because it removes the psychological consent that sustains them. Jesus embodied this state. His authority did not come from force but from coherence. Even those who opposed him sensed it. This is why the Gospels repeatedly describe crowds astonished not by miracles alone, but by the authority with which he spoke. That authority did not come from position. It came from alignment with the divine source. Modern neuroscience unknowingly echoes this ancient truth. Studies on coherence, heart-brain synchronization, and emotional regulation show that states associated with compassion and unconditional regard reorganize the nervous system. A regulated nervous system is far less susceptible to fear-based manipulation. The Archons, in ancient language, represent precisely those forces that exploit dysregulation. But Jesus did not stop at love as an abstract principle. He pointed to something even more subtle. He spoke of carrying light within oneself. He said that the eye is the lamp of the body, and if the eye is single, the whole body will be full of light. This single eye refers to unified perception, a consciousness no longer fragmented by fear, desire, and identity masks. Light, in this sense, is not metaphorical. In many mystical traditions, light represents consciousness aware of itself. The Archons fear this inner light because it cannot be obscured from within. They can distort belief, they can manipulate emotion, but they cannot extinguish a light that is recognized as one's true nature. Elaine Pagels notes that many early Christians believed salvation was not something granted later, but realized now through direct knowledge of the divine spark within. This spark, when ignited, renders external authority irrelevant. This is why such teachings were later labeled heretical. A person who carries their own light cannot be ruled easily. Ask yourself something important. Have you ever felt moments of deep peace, clarity, or compassion that seem to arise without effort? Moments where fear dissolved and life felt whole. That was not imagination. That was a glimpse of what Jesus was pointing toward. But how does one live carrying this sacred object in a world built on fear? How does one protect it from distortion, exhaustion, and distraction? And why did Jesus insist that few would find this path, even though it was available to all? In the next part, we will go deeper. We will explore how the Archons attempt to counterfeit love and light, how religion itself was sometimes used to obscure these teachings, and how you can practically carry this sacred object in daily life without withdrawing from the world. Before I continue, tell me if I should proceed to the next part. Continue writing, please. What makes the teachings of Jesus so dangerous to the Archons is not that they are mystical, but that they are practical. They are meant to be lived, embodied, and carried into the world. And this is precisely where distortion entered, because if the third sacred object, this living state of love and inner light, were fully understood, systems built on fear would collapse from within. The Archons learned to counterfeit it. They learned to replace lived love with moral obligation, inner light with external authority, and awakening with obedience. Instead of inviting people to experience the divine directly, they redirected attention outward, toward rules, hierarchies, and intermediaries. This shift transformed a path of liberation into a structure of control, not because the teachings were false, but because they were inverted. Jesus warned about this repeatedly. He spoke of blind guides leading the blind. He criticized religious authorities who burdened others while remaining inwardly divided. He said that they honored God with their lips while their hearts were far away. These were not political critiques, they were spiritual diagnoses. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says that the Pharisees and the scholars have taken the keys of knowledge and hidden them. They did not enter, and they prevented others from entering. This is a direct reference to inner knowledge, not secret information, but experiential realization. The Archons fear this realization because it bypasses external control entirely. One of their most effective strategies is distraction. Modern life is saturated with noise, urgency, and emotional stimulation. Attention is constantly pulled outward. When attention is fragmented, awareness weakens. When awareness weakens, truth becomes negotiable. And when truth dissolves, love is replaced by fear disguised as identity, ideology, or survival. Jesus countered this with radical simplicity. He urged people to become like children, not naive, but unfragmented. A child is present. A child is whole. A child has not yet learned to divide the world into enemies and allies, sacred and profane. This state of inner unity is what allows love to flow naturally. Early Christian mystics understood this. Clement of Alexandria wrote that the true Gnostic is not one who knows doctrines, but one who lives in harmony with the divine Logos. The Logos was understood as the ordering intelligence of reality itself. To live aligned with it meant to live truthfully, compassionately, and consciously. This alignment created an inner sovereignty that no external power could dominate. The Archons cannot tolerate sovereignty. They require dependency. This is why fear is constantly reinforced. Fear of punishment, fear of rejection, fear of death, fear of meaninglessness. Jesus confronted the deepest of these fears directly. He taught that those who lose their life will find it. This was not a call to self-destruction, but to the death of false identity. The ego constructed by fear must dissolve for the true self to emerge. This is where many people misunderstand the path. They believe carrying this sacred object means withdrawing from the world, rejecting society, or escaping responsibility. Jesus did the opposite. He moved among the people. He healed, taught, confronted injustice, and remained fully engaged. Carrying inner light does not mean avoiding darkness. It means entering it without being consumed. Ask yourself this: when faced with fear, do you contract or expand? Do you defend an image, or do you remain present? Every moment of fear is an opportunity for awakening. Every reaction reveals where fragmentation still exists. This is not a reason for guilt, but for awareness. The Archons lose power each time you respond rather than react, each time you choose presence over impulse, each time you align your actions with your conscience, even when it is uncomfortable, each time you extend compassion without losing discernment. These are not abstract virtues. They are acts of spiritual resistance. Jesus emphasized that the path is narrow and few find it, not because it is hidden, but because it requires inner responsibility. It cannot be delegated. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be outsourced to belief. It must be lived. In the final part, we will bring everything together. We will reveal how these three sacred objects function as one unified force, how you can consciously carry them in daily life, and why this integration represents the true meaning of salvation that Jesus taught. Everything now comes together. Jesus did not reveal three separate sacred objects. He revealed a single, unified state of being expressed through three dimensions of consciousness. Awareness awakens you. Truth aligns you. Love liberates you. Together they form what the ancient teachings described as inner sovereignty. This is the condition the Archons fear most, because it renders their entire system irrelevant. Awareness allows you to see the mechanisms of fear without being absorbed by them. Truth gives you the courage to stop lying to yourself and fragmenting your inner world. Love dissolves separation, the very substance from which domination is formed. When these three operate together, control collapses naturally. No rebellion is required. No enemy needs to be defeated. Illusion simply loses its grip. Jesus encoded this integration throughout his teachings. When he said, "Seek first the kingdom of God," he was not pointing upward or outward, but inward. The kingdom is not a place. It is a state of unified consciousness. When awareness, truth, and love are present, the kingdom is realized here and now. Early Christian mystics understood salvation this way. It was not a transaction, not a future reward, not something granted by an external authority. It was remembrance. To be saved was to remember who you are beneath fear, conditioning, and false identity. Elaine Pagels emphasizes that many early Christians believed ignorance, not sin, was the root of suffering. And ignorance dissolves through awakening, not punishment. This is why Jesus consistently bypassed institutions and spoke directly to individuals. He healed by restoring wholeness, not by enforcing belief. He forgave not to excuse behavior, but to release people from the psychological prisons that bound them. Forgiveness in this sense is another expression of love dissolving separation. To carry this sacred object in daily life does not require special rituals or isolation. It requires presence in ordinary moments. When you notice fear arise and remain conscious, awareness is active. When you refuse to betray your conscience for comfort or approval, truth is active. When you choose compassion without abandoning discernment, love is active. In that moment, the teaching is alive. The Archons attempt to distract you from this simplicity. They encourage endless seeking, external validation, and identification with roles, labels, and conflicts. But Jesus warned that those who search outside themselves will wander endlessly. What you seek is already within you, waiting to be lived. Ask yourself now, not intellectually but honestly, where in your life are you still divided? Where do fear and habit override presence? Where do you know the truth but hesitate to live it? Where does love contract instead of expand? These questions are not meant to judge you. They are invitations to awaken. The most powerful realization is this: you do not need permission to carry this sacred object. You do not need approval, initiation, or authority. The moment you become conscious, aligned, and compassionate, you are already carrying it. This is why Jesus said that the light does not need to be lit. It only needs to stop being hidden. This is also why the final teaching is the most important of all. The Archons fear nothing more than a human being who remembers their inner light and lives from it. Such a person cannot be ruled by fear, cannot be divided by false narratives, and cannot be enslaved by illusion. They move through the world awake, and this is the true meaning behind the words attributed to Jesus. You are the light of the world, not someday, not symbolically, now. If this message resonated with you, reflect on it, carry it into your actions, and share your thoughts below. The path is narrow not because it is hidden, but because it is lived one moment at a time. Thanks for looking.